stand if you're comfy. Okay, Mark 6, 1 through 6. I'm making sure I'm on the right page. Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. "Where did this man get these things?" they asked. "What's this wisdom that has been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he is performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son, the brother of James and Joseph, Judas and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" They took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home." He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. You may be seated.
All right. Good morning, Harvest Ridge. All right, so for the past year, my daughter, Kara, has been going to a preschool over at Community Covenant. And the school is 3 days a week from 9 till 2. And so that means that on those days, Kara is taking with her a boxed lunch that she will then eat at the school. Now, when we are preparing to leave in the mornings, oftentimes things are hectic, stressful, busy. We're hustling to get into the car because it seems like we're always running a little bit late. Some of you probably know how that goes, but I might ask Kara then, did she grab her lunchbox and did she put that lunchbox in her backpack? Now, if Kara says yes, that she grabbed it, for me, that's good enough. Like I'm not gonna like open her bag and check to make sure it's actually in there. I will trust her in that she was truthful, that she did such a thing. I don't feel the need to stop and check the bag. My actions would communicate a sense of trust. However, if I were going skydiving and I had any suspicion at all that Kara or Emmett had even breathed on my parachute, I would probably not be jumping out of that plane. But I would say on the other hand, if I knew a trained or professional parachute rigger had packed that backpack for me, I would probably be much more okay jumping out of the plane. If only I weren't terrified of heights. That would be my one hang up. So the degree then of our trust in someone can be seen by how we act and live in light of that trust. The degree of our trust, it can be seen by how we live in light of that trust. So it's one thing to trust a rope. When you're using that rope to say tie furniture onto the back of your pickup truck because you're moving furniture. That's one thing to trust a rope in that situation. It's another thing to trust a rope when you're using it to rappel down the side of a mountain. And if someone says to you, yeah, I think that rope is probably strong enough, in the first example, you're probably okay still getting in the truck and driving off with the furniture. But in the second example, if someone says, yeah, I think that rope's probably strong enough, you're probably going to be hiking down the long way, not rappelling down the side of the mountain. So when it comes to the Christian faith, one of the most important concepts we talk about in Christianity is faith. It's this word faith and what that means. Faith is a belief in something, but more than a belief in something, it's a trusting in something. It's trusting in it, in the object, or in our case, trusting in a person. And this is one of those concepts that I think is probably largely misunderstood in our culture today. So in our culture, in our world, and I would say even prevalent within many of our churches, is the belief that faith in Jesus is simply about saying you're a Christian or about holding certain thoughts in your head about God or Jesus as true. So people believe in Jesus in the same way that they believe that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon in 1969. They accept it as a true fact, but it's not really something that impacts their life. And I would say this is basically a misunderstanding of biblical faith. Biblical faith is not about cognitive concepts or beliefs that we hold in our head to be true. It's not about verbal agreement or mental assent. Biblical faith is trusting in Jesus to the point that it affects our actions. It is trusting in Jesus and who he says he is, trusting that he is Lord and King, that he's Son and Messiah, that he's the way, the truth, and the life, and trusting in these things to such a degree that it shapes and it bends our life around those truths. If these claims do not shape or bend our life, if they do not influence the way that we live, then we do not have biblical faith. Biblical faith is believing and trusting in the words of Jesus so that they influence how we live. We take those words seriously. We obey and we live out the teachings of Jesus in our lives. Biblical faith is trusting in Jesus for salvation to the point that we despair of our own strength, our own ability to save ourselves, and we fall entirely on the grace and the mercy of God. It's knowing that only through Christ and his sacrifice can we find forgiveness and acceptance. Biblical faith is trusting in God's mercy and his grace to the point that it leads us to live lives of humility and compassion and generosity towards others. It is trusting in God's sovereignty to the point that it leads us to sacrifice and to take risks for the gospel. It is trusting in God's love to the point that it reduces or eliminates anxiety and worry on the one hand, or self-reliance and pride on the other. In short, a life that bends to the lordship of Jesus Christ is one that looks different from the world. To use our analogy, biblical faith isn't just looking at a parachute or a rope and verbally saying, I trust that with my life. Biblical faith is actually jumping out of the plane or jumping off the side of a mountain. It is something you don't just say standing on the sidelines, but biblical faith is something you demonstrate by the actions that you take. It doesn't just say Jesus is Lord, but it demonstrates that Jesus is Lord by the way we live and we act. Now, I say all of this morning as sort of a foundation for our text, because I think it's going to help us to understand what's going on in our passage this morning. There are several things about our passage that are probably difficult to understand. One of the more striking elements is the fact that the people of Jesus' hometown, they're amazed by Jesus. They recognize there's wisdom to his words, and they recognize that he has this power to do miracles. And yet, it's striking that it says they were offended by it. Why is it that they were offended by Jesus' words, his wisdom, and his miracles? What is it that offended them? And the second major element or question here is the connection between honor and faith. So these people were offended by Jesus, and Jesus makes the comment that a prophet has no honor in his hometown. And it says that Jesus is therefore amazed by their lack of faith. So these are some of the things we're going to look at this morning. I'll be giving kind of plenty of background as we go, a lot more probably in depth towards the culture in the first century world than sometimes. But let's start now looking back at Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And it says, Jesus left there, talking about the Sea of Galilee, and he went to his hometown. So we know his hometown is Nazareth. So this is roughly a 10 to 12 hour walk between the sea and Nazareth. It says he's accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were, and notice this word, amazed. They were amazed. Now, pause there for a second. Jesus is not officially a rabbi. In other words, he does not have the approval of the temple leadership. And so he would not normally be someone who is teaching in synagogues. Now, some scholars suggest that this is perhaps part of the service where it was opened for anyone to share. So this was a common thing where they would read a text, and anyone who wanted to share could have the opportunity to share about the text. That was a common practice. Some have suggested that that's when this is happening. But I would say based on what we know from Luke's gospel, that's probably not the case. It seems likely that Jesus was given the honor to serve as the primary teacher, the primary expositor. I imagine at this point, Jesus' reputation was beginning to precede him. He's becoming well known as a rabbi because he's gaining a following. And the fact that Jesus walks into town with 12 disciples only confirms this truth, this picture that he's becoming a rabbi, that he is a rabbi. People were having to take Jesus seriously at this point. So there's something going on here, and I think probably the people were curious. What is all this commotion about? What is everyone amazed about with this person, Jesus, that we all knew, that we were all raised, he was raised in our midst, he was raised in our town, we know who this person is. What's going on with this Jesus movement? So I imagine that's part of why he was asked to be the teacher that week. Now notice also in verse 2, it says that many who heard him were amazed. Now amazed is probably a weak translation there. Other translations will say astonished or greatly astounded. So these are people who recognize something incredible is happening. And keep this in mind because as we read through chapter 2, we're going to look at what it is that amazes them. So let's listen to what is said next there in verse 2. Where does this man get these things, they asked. In other words, how could Jesus have learned this? Like we know where Jesus is from, we know his occupation. How does Jesus get this information? And then the next question is, what's this wisdom that has been given him? Now, that's kind of an absurd question because all Jewish people should know that wisdom comes only from God. Proverbs 2:6 says, all wisdom comes from the Lord. Daniel 2:21 and 22 says, it is God who gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who understand. So they're acknowledging here that Jesus has wisdom, but they're not admitting the source, which should be very obvious, that wisdom is coming from God. They don't want to accept that his wisdom is coming from God. And then the next question, what are these remarkable miracles that he's performing? Probably here speaking of the miracles we've just read about in Mark's gospel. So things like calming the storm by his words, or casting out demons from people, healing the sick, these types of things. I'm sure they've heard of these things and they're asking, what are these miracles that he's doing? Again, these are only things that God could do, by the way. And so they should know, right? They should know the answer to these questions. It says that people were amazed by these events, but then notice here verse 3, isn't this the carpenter? Now imagine probably that this is being said with a derogatory tone. Isn't this the carpenter? I'll get to that in a second. Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And then notice this, they took offense then at Jesus. So notice this shift. It goes from amazement at Jesus' teachings, his wisdom, his miracles, but it suddenly ends with, and they were offended. They took offense at Jesus. And between those 2 points, their amazement and their offense, we see them acknowledge, or they note Jesus' occupation, that he was a carpenter, and they note his family, his mother and his siblings are in town. So what do we do with this? Notice here, I want to add verse 4 real quick before we get to some background here. Notice what Jesus says in verse 4. Jesus sees what happens. He sees their doubt. And then he says to them, a prophet is not without honor. Notice that word. He's not without honor except in his hometown, his own town, among his relatives and in his own home. So it's kind of hard to understand the double negatives there, but a prophet is not without honor. In other words, a prophet has honor elsewhere except his hometown. His hometown that he does not have honor, but everywhere else a prophet would have honor. So a prophet receives honor everywhere except his hometown. Now why is this? And what is this really about? Now some people would suggest that this is the reason is that it's just hard to conceive of a person being a great prophet when you used to watch them walking around town wearing diapers, okay? Or when you saw them cry the first time they fell and scraped their knee. The TV show, The Chosen, I don't know if anyone's watching that show, The Chosen, they actually hint at that same interpretation. By showing, it's kind of creative, by showing Jesus play a game of ball and being bad at it. He's playing this game, that sports that they're playing, and he's actually bad at it. And all of his friends, they're indicating that nothing's really changed, right? This is the same Jesus. This is the same Jesus who's still bad at sports, just like we've always known him. So surely he's not changed that much. I think it's a creative part of the show, and I think there's probably an element of truth to that. But I also think there's something more than that. There's probably a primary motivating factor for their rejecting of Jesus, more than that even. And here I want to pause for a little bit, and I want to talk about this topic, honor, the topic of honor. I think it's important to understand here for understanding what's happening in the context in this passage. So the people are amazed. They see Jesus doing great things. They don't like it. They're offended by it. They question his background as a carpenter and his family in town. And Jesus says their problem is one of honor. So let me go into some background here. So in most ancient cultures, and I would say even most Eastern cultures today, are what sociologists would call honor-shame cultures. So honor-shame is largely how people view their place in comparison to others in society. Now, the first thing to know is that honor in the ancient world was considered a zero-sum game. It's a zero-sum game. So honor was a limited commodity. Because honor was always in relation to those around you, to other people, that meant if one person's honor goes up, then another person's honor had to go down. Now, that might seem strange to us, but actually I think we kind of get it to some degree. At least I would say in the world of sports. So I had a professor from college who was a very big Tom Brady, New England Patriots fan. Like, very big fan. And I'm still friends with this professor on social media, and I remember a comment he made recently about why he was cheering against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. And his comment was that he doesn't want the Chiefs to become a great dynasty because he feels like it would take some of the shine away from the Patriots and their dynasty. Okay, do you understand then? In other words, if another dynasty were to rival the Patriots, it would decrease the honor given to his favorite team. As one team's honor goes up, another team's honor seems to in society to go down. I'll give another example also from football. The only team to ever have a perfect season was the 1972 Miami Dolphins. They went 17-0, and they won the Super Bowl that year. And I've heard that for a long time, the players from that team would always meet together and celebrate whenever the last remaining undefeated team had lost that year. And so every year, whenever the final remaining undefeated team had lost, they would meet together to celebrate. Because it meant that their uniqueness of having the only perfect season would remain intact. And the idea then is that if another team ever had a perfect season, then it would decrease the honor of what they had accomplished. Okay, do you see how that works? Now take that idea of honor, zero-sum game, one person's honor increases, another person's go down, and now apply that to everything in life. Honor was such a big part of how ancient people saw themselves in that day. Honor was so important to that culture that scholars would actually say honor is like a currency. Like it can be banked and used to accomplish certain things. A person's level of honor, it determined much about their outcome in life. Your level of honor determined your potential marriage partners, who you were able to marry. It determined your business and your economic opportunities. The greater your level of honor, the greater chance of financial success and security in life. Honor determined what social events you got invited to, who your friends were, and where you sat at the table. The more honor you possessed, the closer you got to sit at the host providing the meal. Interestingly, but Jesus taught people not to take the seats of honor, but to, unless the owner comes and he moves you down a chair or a couple chairs, in which case you would be humiliated in front of all your friends. But Jesus said instead to take the seat of dishonor so that when the owner comes and moves you forward, you'll be honored in front of everyone. Jesus was reversing here the way that people thought about their lives. Honor determines how many people come to your social events. If you're gonna throw a party in town, honor determines how many people come and who comes, the type of people who are gonna come to your house. If someone with a lot of honor comes to your event, then it increases your own honor in the community. Interestingly, again, but Jesus tells several parables about a king who throws a feast, and he's inviting the people of honor, which the people who have things, which in this illustration is the Jews. But those people, they reject his invitation. And so the king then sends out servants to bring in the people of dishonor, the poor, the crippled, the lowly of society. And in this instance, it's symbolizing the Gentiles. So it's a very rather offensive parable, by the way, to basically everybody. Almost nobody in that society would have liked hearing that parable. So honor determines where you could live also and where you could do business. So even the towns you could live in were often determined by your degree of honor. Nazareth, by the way, was not an honorable town. Nazareth was a know-nothing town of about 500 people on the road to nowhere. It was built on the side of a rocky mountain. There was not much happening in that town. Nazareth is never mentioned at all in the Old Testament or in the Jewish Mishnah or in the Talmud or in the writings of the historian Josephus. This is a town of no significance. When Nathanael was told that Jesus was from Nazareth, his response was, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And so a family of sufficient honor might have been able to leave Nazareth and make a living in, say, Capernaum or another nearby city with more prestige. Now you put all of that together then, and this meant that honor was a deadly serious matter for people in that culture. Honor was to be defended at all costs because it had real and serious consequences, not just for yourself and your life, but also for your future and for the future of your family. Now, that's sort of the concept of honor. But how does a person obtain honor in the ancient world? Sociologists speak of two main ways that a person holds honor. There is ascribed honor and acquired honor. Ascribed honor is the honor that is derived from birth. Basically the type of family that you're born into. This includes things like your family's wealth, their reputation, their occupations. Occupations were largely determined, or families were largely determinative of what your occupation would be. There's things like family genealogy, whether you descend from a good line or whether there's bad characters in your history. Interestingly, people today, when we do genealogy, we often like to connect ourselves to famous people. We don't often say, well, I'm descended from this terrible crook of a person or something like that. It's always the famous people that we connect ourselves with, right? So similar things there. Honor determines that. Honor is determined by things like your family history, whether your family has served in the military or done something generous or courageous in town, and that continues to get talked about. Now, on the other hand, that's acquired honor. On the other hand is, it's acquired. So that was ascribed. On the other hand is acquired. So acquired honor is the honor that comes through your skills, qualities, or virtues that are recognized and approved by the community. So this kind of honor can be tricky because you might be very good at something, but if you go about it the wrong way, then you violate the society's standards of virtue and you actually bring dishonor on yourself and your family. So it's not enough just to be good at something, but you have to use your goodness, use your skill in a way that is good for society, for the people. So for instance, societies, they recognize things like courage in battle, generosity with wealth, integrity, trustworthiness. These are good virtues for the overall society. And so these are things that were considered honorable and to be promoted in the society. However, other qualities like pride, greed, selfishness, stinginess, cowardice, these were negative for society. And so it becomes the job of people then to rein in and to control such behaviors. And honor shame is how you manage those behaviors. Now, one other virtue we need to talk about here, it's important to our text. This virtue is defended and guarded, and it's the virtue of maintaining your place in the honor system. To maintain your place in the honor system. Again, this is hard for us to concept, especially being Americans, where the American dream is that you rise from the bottom to make something of your life, right? That's sort of this idea that the Pilgrims and the early Americans were founded on. So we don't resonate with this, but I would say other cultures like India, in traditional India, maybe not so much today, but had the caste system. This place in society was essential so that when early Christians went to India and they began to share the gospel and they began to welcome people to the table from different caste levels, that was considered a cardinal sin in that society. And many of those early Christians were attacked, persecuted, or even murdered not because they were sharing Jesus, this new religion, but because they were welcoming people of different systems to the same table to eat together. That was considered the sin. And that is still prevalent. That was prevalent in this day and age as well too, this sort of caste system of honor. So it's deemed unstabling to society whenever a person's fame reached beyond their level of honor. That's bad for society when that happens. And so it's sort of the job of society to rein people back, to pull them back and to keep them in their acceptable level of honor. And that is what I think is happening with Jesus. In fact, if you remember back to Mark 3, we see in verses 20 and 21, it says, Jesus entered a house and again a crowd gathered so that, here's how big the crowd was, so that he and his disciples could not even eat. They were not able to eat because of how large the crowd was. And in the very next verse, listen to this. When his family, Jesus' family, heard about Jesus' popularity and the large crowds that are gathering, they went to take charge of him. They went to rein him in, to control him, to pull him back. For they said, he's out of his mind. So it was in response to Jesus' popularity that his family felt the need to rein him back, to pull him back, because he was getting outside of his acceptable level of honor. His fame was getting to a level that was deemed unsettling for society. And I think this can actually be understandable for us to some degree as well. We, again, are a different culture, but we still kind of get this as well to some degrees. I remember hearing a story of a kid from Appalachia who grew up very poor, impoverished area. But this kid did really well in life. He got accepted to an Ivy League law school. I think it was Yale. And he talked about, though, how embarrassed his mother was to tell others in that society that her son was at an Ivy League school. In fact, he gave his mom a shirt or a sweatshirt that said Yale written on it, and his mother would never wear that shirt in public because she was so worried that others would look at her and the fact that her son was at an Ivy League school and that they would think, oh, she's getting too good for us. He's getting too good for us. He's outgrown us. His level of honor has exceeded what is our people, our culture, our society. And so the mother felt shame, and the son, he felt embarrassed too. He didn't want to tell people he was at Yale because he felt like he was a traitor to those that he grew up around. I would say even several subcultures in America today, there is this cultural mindset where college is even frowned down upon because it's deemed as rising above and beyond the level of your community. Where even going to college is seen as the desire to abandon your family and your people. This, I think, is a close picture of how honor shame works to keep people in places. And I think this is a very close approximation to the people's rejection now of Jesus. It isn't that they saw Jesus in diapers once upon a time. It's that Jesus has now risen beyond the acceptable level of honor. And now the people are offended by it. And I think there's a couple of hints in this. So look again at verse 3. One of the questions they ask is, isn't this the carpenter? We'll come to this in a second. Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters, and notice the focus here, aren't his sisters here with us? I think the focus is that they are still here with us. They've not outgrown us. Why is Jesus then so intent on gaining all this fame and this popularity? Also notice they identify Jesus as a carpenter. That would have been Jesus' occupation as a young man. He would have learned it from his father Joseph, who was also a carpenter. Now the word carpenter is probably a little bit misleading. We think of carpenters primarily today as someone who works and builds and repairs things with wood. Jesus' occupation is probably broader than that. So the Greek word for Jesus' occupation is tekton. Tekton is part of where we get our English word architect. So arch is the Greek word for chief or lead. Tech from tekton means builder. So an architect is a chief or lead builder. Okay, that's where we get the word. Now in that culture, a tekton could have worked in a number of fields. So one scholar says that a tekton is a person who, quote, would have worked with wood, metal, or stone. He could have been a builder, a mason, or a carpenter. In Jesus' Palestinian context, it probably denoted a handyman. He would have had the skill to do almost anything, from crafting plows and yokes to making pieces of furniture, cupboards, stools, and benches, to erecting even small buildings, particularly making the beams, window lattices, doors, and bolts. It's also likely that Jesus would have traveled as a carpenter to surrounding areas looking for work. Again, if you watch the show The Chosen, they actually portray this detail. That on his job, Jesus is traveling from one place to another. And that's a detail I think the show got right. But the thing about carpenters in that culture, though, is that it was not considered an honorable job. Carpenters were very poor. They worked with their hands, which Greek culture looked down upon. And you had to travel seeking work, seeking jobs. And all of those elements would have made Jesus' occupation deemed dishonorable or unhonorable. Which again, then I think explains part of the reason the people took offense at Jesus and his rising above his levels of honor. Now let's turn back now to our final verses of the text. So verses 4-6. And remember now, the people were amazed at Jesus' teaching and his miracles, but then they point out his family, his occupational background, and suddenly now they're offended. And look again at verse 4. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor. That is, he has honor normally, except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. And then verse 5, Jesus could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And then here is his interpretation. He was amazed. Notice that word again. Amazed at their lack of faith. So we see this movement from amazement to amazement. They're amazed at Jesus and what he teaches. Now he's amazed at their lack of faith. And Jesus interprets their lack of faith as a result of the honor that they do not show him. Now it's interesting here, also verse 5, it says Jesus could not do any miracles. Now whenever you see that phrase, Jesus couldn't do something, that raises a lot of questions. Like, Jesus is the one here who spoke and calmed the wind and the waves in Mark 4. Jesus is, which is something that only God could do. Jesus is the one who cast out the legion of demons from a man in the early parts of Mark 5. Again, something that puts him in the realm of the divine. And then at the end of Mark 5, we see that Jesus even raised the dead to life. And so it's striking here, we get to Mark 6 now, and it says Jesus could not perform miracles in that region except heal a few people. And that raises the question, why? Now, one answer that I do not think is right, but I've heard it maybe once before, is that Jesus' power to perform miracles is conditioned or dependent on the degree of people's faith. As though, in other words, unbelief is like Jesus' kryptonite, making it impossible for him to do anything. It's like unbelief zaps his faith, so to speak. Now, I think there's many problems probably with that view. But even here in the context, though, the people, they know, they see, and they hear what Jesus is doing. Like, they believe he has some sort of power. That's not the problem. The problem is they question, where did that come from? They don't accept it, and they refuse to honor Jesus for who he is. So that's the nature of the lack of faith. And so this brings us back then, I think, to what I started with in the introduction of our message. What is the nature of faith? And how does that relate to honor in our passage this morning? And to answer that question, I want to go back really just a couple paragraphs, what we looked at last week, the passage from last week. Last week we saw the stories of two hopeless and desperate individuals. There was the woman who had suffered from bleeding for 12 years, and there was the father Jairus, whose daughter was on the verge of death. Both individuals were commended for their faith. And so I think here, this contrast is intentional, that they serve as a contrast to the people of Nazareth in our passage this morning. And so what do we learn about from those two individuals, from the woman bleeding and Jairus, the father? Well, if you remember last week, the woman bleeding, she believed if I could only touch the corner of his cloak, even without him knowing, then she could be healed. So her faith led to her action. It led her to depend on Jesus and his power. It was a faith that trusted Jesus and who he claimed to be, and Jesus commended her for her faith. Now, as for Jairus the father, he was staking everything on the fact that Jesus could save his daughter. Rather than going to a doctor to try to find some last-minute emergency help, Jairus banked everything on going to Jesus. If Jesus failed, his daughter would die. Jesus was banking not only on Jesus' power to save, his ability to save, but Jairus was banking also on Jesus' compassion, his willingness to save. There was a trust in Jesus' character, and that trust led Jairus to seek Jesus out, even when everything was on the line. In both cases, it was their faith that led them to seek Jesus and to cast themselves on Jesus and to depend entirely on Jesus, even when life was on the line. Both individuals honored Jesus by falling before him and trusting fully in his salvation, his power, his restoration, and his loving character. Their actions declared to all that they trusted this person of Jesus. They trusted the power and the wisdom of God through him, and they trusted his ability to heal. In so doing, they publicly transferred honor to Jesus. In our passage this morning, the people, they recognize the wisdom of Jesus' words. They recognize Jesus' power to heal and save. And yet they do not have true faith because they are not led then to trust in Jesus. They do not seek Jesus. And therefore, I believe that's why Jesus literally cannot do miracles, is because people are not trusting and depending on him. They're not coming to him, seeking him in that way. Had they, though, trusted and sought Jesus, depending fully on him, and thus giving honor to Jesus, then they could have been healed and saved. And I think this teaching shows us a greater truth than merely the fact that Jesus had healed people 2,000 years ago, or could have healed people 2,000 years ago. I think this is meant to illustrate for us the nature of faith today. That faith is not merely about being amazed at Jesus' power or teachings. It isn't a trusting of one's life, it is a trusting of one's life. It is desperately depending on him for our life and our salvation. And in so doing, we are honoring Jesus for who he is. When it comes to Jesus, we come to him as he is, as Lord and King. And this means we accept as though we are not Lord and King of our lives. This is the only approach that truly honors Jesus. And it is the means by which we experience new life in him. In conclusion then, it is not enough for us to marvel and be amazed at Jesus' teachings and works. The crowd in Nazareth was amazed by Jesus, but they refused to honor Jesus by coming and depending on him. It's also not enough to cognitively hold a belief about Jesus in our heads or about his work. James chapter 2 says, "Show your faith by your deeds. You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe and shudder." It's also not enough to simply state or claim that Jesus is Lord. Jesus says in Matthew 7, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." In all of these cases, there is a work, an action, an honor that is missing from these people's faith. And in short, what is missing is true biblical faith. So let us then be a people who not just claim faith, but let us demonstrate a trust in Jesus that brings and gives him all honor. Let us trust the parachute of Christ's lordship as we jump from the plane of self-reliance and prideful autonomy. Let us trust the rope of God's love as we live out our mission and our purpose and our calling in this world. Please pray with me. God, we recognize that there's probably many areas of our lives that all of us have that are probably not totally aligned with your lordship, your kingship. God, we can probably be honest and admit that there's probably elements of disobedience, there's elements of pride, there's elements of selfish autonomy or control that we seek to have. And God, I pray that we would be aware of these things, that we would be convicted of these things. God, that we would come to examine our own hearts and our motivations. And God, ask this question of whether we are truly depending and trusting in you for our life, for our salvation, and for even our joy, our lack of anxiety, the way that we live on this earth. God, help us to depend fully on you, depending on your love, on your goodness, on your sovereignty, and on your grace. God, so that we demonstrate to all around us what it looks like to have faith. God, we pray for your help in all of this. We ask in your name. Amen.